he did come back on, and then they had to remove him again. Because that's how you see like all the blood running out of his mouth and down the side of his cheek. But he might have been concussed at that time, so it's hard to tell. You know. But I do think that it speaks to something that really matters. Because if you look at the fallout of this, I technically don't know what these guys were. Because they seemed to be like airport cops. I don't know that that's a real thing. No, not air marshals. They couldn't have been security. So security and police, those are two different things. Y'all understand that, right? Okay, because two of the guys on the back of their shirt, it actually said police. Which means that they're not actually sworn like public servant police officers. Those two should be arrested for impersonating police officers. And if they are some sort of sworn public servant, we need to realize in this country that we need to stop beating people. We need to stop having the police beat people up. Good morning, Baker. Nope. He's supposed to be in here, but I don't know where he is. Yep. So, yeah, the issue of police brutality in this country is a little out of hand, right? And if you haven't seen the video, you really, the police are going to sit there and be like, he was resisting arrest, which is sad because he was not really resisting, right? At least not in the sense of what resisting should be. No one in their right mind goes, yes, please arrest me. I would like that. We all resist. The issue is whether or not you're forcibly resisting. Okay? And if you don't like that one, go look at the little 100-pound sorority girl in Colorado that a police officer just threw face first to the ground a couple days ago. Right? And all because she shoulder checked a police officer. Right? That means that she apparently ran through him and did that. Because she was trying to get her to her boyfriend who was apparently being arrested for having been in a bar fight with somebody else. And I'm going to tell you right now, if I don't know.
Can you write me a nurse pass or is this voting more?
No, I don't know who you are.
Alfred B. ID number 150618. May you please write me a nurse pass because my thumb is bleeding. Miss Bodie says that her nerves don't come in until tomorrow. So until tomorrow, I can't get a nurse pass.
Come here, son. What's your name?
Alfred B.
Spell it.
A-L-F-R-E-D-B-E-E.
There you go. Okay. All right. We'll use that interruption to actually just move on. How's that? Sorry. No more talk with police brutality and beating people up. All right. Hey, we're gonna look at. We're going to look at government regulations for businesses today. Regulations basically just means rules. Alright? You don't really need to write down all the individual types that are in the parentheses there. Don't worry about that so much. Alright? The regulations exist in order to try to promote some sort of desired goal. Alright, this is government trying to influence or dictate behavior. Alright, there's some various types of regulations. The first would be economic. So these are to try to regulate some sort of behavior within businesses or within a marketplace. Alright, your early examples of these would be antitrust law. You should remember this from APUSH, yes? Sherman Antitrust Act, Clayton Antitrust Act, we remember these? Okay, this is governmental response to monopolies created as a result of industrialization. We need to have some sort of regulations to ensure that monopolies are not taking advantage of the citizens. Alright? Additionally, you also have regulations within the stock market in order to ensure that there's not any sort of fraud or insider trading or behaviors of that matter, alright, or nature, I guess. Next, you have social regulations. These are various types of regulations that are aimed at sort of improving the lives of individuals, alright. So, worker safety regulations, child labor laws, things of that nature. Again, most of this should be reviewed from last year with APUSH. Do you remember the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire? Some of you yes, some of you no. Okay, this was a clothing manufacturer. I don't know what the girls were actually making. I guess shirtwaists? I don't know what shirtwaists are. Well, I mean, it was a shirtwaist factory, so I'm assuming that's what they're making. Don't know. So, ultimately what happened is you had a situation where the back staircase was shut, it was locked, it was padlocked from the inside, so you couldn't go down the back stairs. The front exit was, like, intentionally filtered down to where only one person could get through at a time in order to have the girls checked to ensure that they weren't stealing, like, material. And so when the actual fire broke out, a whole bunch of people died as a result, right? Like 7 girls got out onto the fire escape, but then the fire escape fell off the side of the building. This is one of those things that sort of shows the necessity or the need for some sort of regulations, right? Like if you're going to have a fire escape, it probably needs to be bolted to the side of the building and actually usable, right? A lot of this comes out of the result of monopolies or oligopolies, right? And that's a term that you might not be familiar with. An oligopoly is simply a monopoly of like 3 or 4 companies or corporations that are basically price fixing together, right? A decent example of this, although it's not quite 100% true anymore, decent example of this a few years ago would have been like cell phone companies, because there was really only 4 options and they all charged you ridiculously more than what they really needed to, right? That's an oligopoly. A lot of this regulation stems from atrocious working conditions. Again, if you go back to the time of industrialization in the United States, you had people working by candlelight in factories with like oil. Oil and fire don't mix. You understand that concept? Highly flammable. So the fact that you're working by candlelight, not a good idea. Additionally, like I said, fire escapes, things like that, any sort of safety precautions were generally not taken into account at that point in time. And employers essentially looked at employees and basically told them to shut their mouths, quit complaining, and be grateful that they had a job in the first place. Right? Unsafe and unhealthy products are another sort of cause of it. You should. How many of you had Meyer Wilkening last year? Oh, not very many of you. So if you had me or Wilkening, you would remember the whole cooking sausage. Yeah, if you had somebody else, I don't know what you did for the jungle. What?
Gave us sausage roll with part of the jungle.
Oh dear.
Pretty nice.
Yeah, so The Jungle was a book by Upton Sinclair in like 1906. You could sort of count him as a muckraking journalist, I guess. But The Jungle is basically a detailed portrayal of the meatpacking industry and how, you know, you'd be working on the line, cutting up beef, and all of a sudden you'd slice your finger off and it would just go on down the conveyor belt line and get ground up into the ground beef. Right? Well, I don't know. That might not be true. It might have ended up in the sausage. One of the two. Hey. Well, and in all honesty, if it wasn't like human meat that you were eating when you were eating your ground beef, there was definitely some rat and probably some like rat excrement in there as well.
You're talking about that, like, oh, never mind.
I'm talking like 110 or 120 years ago.
Thank you.
We now have regulations because of this to ensure that when it says you are eating beef, you can rest assured that you are eating beef. And not Steve. Alright. Okay, so what happens is we begin to regulate all of this stuff. Understand that one of the early things here is the regulation of monopolies. Government will tell you that not all monopolies are bad. Some monopolies are actually government, like, sponsored monopolies. Any of you plan on going to college outside of Texas? Handful of you. So, Texas is odd. If you move to states other than Texas, most of the time, when you go and get an apartment somewhere, you do not have any say in what energy company you want to use. You get one option and that's it, right? So if you want electricity, you have to use Duke Energy, or you have to use whatever, right? Those are obviously monopolies. You don't get a say in it. And those are like state-sponsored, government-sponsored monopolies, right? Comically, like landline telephones in the 1990s, early 2000s, when people still had landlines, those were government monopoly as well. Because in the 1980s, the government actually broke up AT&T because AT&T used to own all the phone company, like all that stuff. But yeah. So, we're going to break up monopolies that are abusive in order to restore competition. That's the primary concern. Right? Over time, we're also going to develop other sorts of agencies. So, what you should realize or what you should understand, because these are agencies. Understand that. But you see how the two examples up there, they end in C? You know what the C stands for? Commission. Okay? Commission. Commissions are charged with regulating things, right? So the FCC is the Federal Communications Commission. It is charged with regulating like television and radio and things like that, right? So you guys are too young to remember Howard Stern when he was on the radio.
Yeah.
Okay? Well, he went off the radio in like 2001.
Yeah.
Okay? In the 80s and 90s, Howard Stern basically had a running feud with the FCC in which he did everything in his power to say words in which the FCC would want to fine him, but he figured out ways to say the word in a manner in which the FCC couldn't fine him.
The 7 wonderful first words.
That's George Carlin. That's completely different.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I messed up.
Yeah. Okay. You're probably old enough to remember the Justin Timberlake, Janet Jackson Super Bowl halftime show, right? That is the FCC that is in charge of imposing fines and regulating that because, you know, a bunch of little kids were watching that and they were traumatized as a result, I guess. Alright. SEC, same concept here. The SEC is charged with regulating securities and exchanges, which basically means the stock market. Alright. In recent times, I want you to understand that there's been, in terms of like monopolies, there's been a pronounced lack of government involvement in what's going on. Right? So the U.S. government has not become as progressive or as involved in these issues. Sometimes because the mergers are seemingly unrelated. Other times, government just seemingly does not want to get involved, right? Disney bought out ESPN, for example. Mickey Mouse, LeBron James, not compatible. Like, that's not a monopoly, right? R.J. Reynolds and Nabisco, not really. Like, we know what Nabisco is, right? The little Keebler Elves, the cookies, crackers, like Nabisco. We know what that is. Y'all know what R.J. Reynolds is? I'm glad to hear that. Because at your age, you should not know what R.J. Reynolds is. Tobacco. Right? R.J. Reynolds is a cigarette manufacturer in North Carolina. Okay? So again, cigarettes and crackers, don't know that those are really some sort of monopoly that would require some sort of reaction from the government. Now, on the other hand, you do have sometimes where the government is going to get involved, and Microsoft is a really good example of this. All right, do I have anybody in here that's like just big into computer programming and loves computers? Do you?
I got flat.
Hopefully I will explain this fairly well. I'm not a huge computer guy. But we know what Microsoft is, right? We've heard that term. We know Microsoft's primary product is Windows, right? So Windows, it's an operating system, yes? We understand that concept. We know. Stop eating in my class. So we know that Windows is an operating system, yes?
Yes.
Okay, so if you create a video game, right, and you want it to work on Windows, how do you accomplish that?
You have a company.
Lorenzo?
You have to do a contact and implement it and format it to get the right format of that.
So it has to be formatted to be compatible with Windows, right? Do you think Microsoft gives everybody the coding to make it compatible? No, that would be pretty stupid of Microsoft, right? So what they do is they sit there and they say, if you want it to be Microsoft compatible, if you want it to be Windows compatible, you have to give us your product, right? We'll tinker with the coding, we'll make sure that it's compatible, then we'll give it back to you, right? Now, if you were a really sort of cutthroat businessman, right, and let's just say for the sake of argument that somebody came up with this phenomenal program called like QuickBooks, which is not that phenomenal a program, but I can't think of anything else off the top of my head. QuickBooks helps you manage your finances, right? So that's basically what it is. It's an accounting software for you, especially if you have like a small business that you do things with. All right? So you created QuickBooks, you give QuickBooks to Microsoft, Microsoft makes it Windows compatible, they give it back to you, right? Now, do you think Microsoft was doing anything else at the same time? They were copying it. And now you go to market and you're like, here's this great thing to help you budget your, handle your finances and you can all save money and we'll all be better off in the long run. And Microsoft comes out the same day and goes, hey, we have a really similar product to that. It's going to come out in like a month, but it's the Windows version. right? And then people like me who don't understand computers all that well, what do?
You buy the Windows version. Seems easier.
I'm gonna buy the Windows version because that seems easier, right? Now I don't have to worry about possible compatibility issues. And should that action be illegal? What Microsoft is doing should be illegal, yes. Alright.
They would say mouses, to get the mouse a long time ago. They one of the companies would sell to them, and so they bought out every computer that uses the mouse, and then starved that company down, and then bought that company and put the mouse on force basically.
Fascinating. Yeah, that really probably shouldn't happen. Alright. Now, there are debates over regulation. Not that this should surprise anybody, because we have debates over all sorts of things in this country, right? So, there are those people who are in favor of regulation, because they see regulation as being something that helps prevent unhealthy monopolies. That's an accurate statement. Regulation can help prevent unhealthy monopolies, right? It protects customers from safe and unhealthy products. Again, this is an accurate statement, right? Regulations ensure that when you go to the grocery store and you're buying some ground chuck, that chuck is actually beef and not chuck. Alright? And then again, it protects people from sort of unsafe or unfair practices, right? So you have regulations that say truck drivers can't drive more than, what is it, like 60 hours in a week? And they can't drive more than, what, 12 hours in a day without an 8-hour break or something like that? And there are regulations that exist like this because they've actually done studies, and apparently driving tired is the equivalent of driving drunk in terms of slowed reaction times. Right? And we obviously, I mean, it's bad enough when somebody in a car is driving tired like Kyle looks right now. You don't really look awake. That's okay. But a tractor trailer, a semi-truck would be even more troubling. Alright? And then regulations protect people from unsafe working conditions. Okay, again, things like regulations for fire safety codes. Alright? Sorry. There are then some serious arguments against regulation. I'm going to go ahead and give you the easiest, sort of simplest argument, and that is that regulations are really a sort of violation of free market capitalism. Right? I don't know how much detail you go into in economics of free market capitalism, but here's the basic premise, and we'll use a case that is going to be heard before the Supreme Court here shortly. All right? There was a baker in Colorado that refused to bake a wedding cake for a homosexual couple. All right? Now, you can put regulations in place that force that baker to bake a cake. I'm going to go ahead and tell you right now, that's a little ridiculous and kind of stupid. And in all honesty, it's stupid on the part of the person who wants to force that baker to bake said cake. Because I'm going to go ahead and tell you right now, if I was that baker, I would make the nastiest cake I possibly could. Like literally, instead of using sugar, I would use salt. Right? So, can you have regulations? Yes. Are those regulations sometimes seemingly wonderful? Sure. Right? We would love to have a regulation that says you can't discriminate against people. Because obviously discrimination is bad. We don't want discrimination. But here's the thing. In a truly free market capitalist system, right? If you don't want to do that for somebody, right? You decide that you don't want to serve them. Oh well. Right? In a truly free market capitalist system, you have that authority. Okay? And then when you make that comment like, hey, we don't serve your kind, then you're gonna have two options, right? One, you've just turned away people that were trying to give you business, which is gonna cause you to go out of business. Two, you're gonna have some sort of backlash that's gonna provide you with very negative publicity, right? That being said, there is the argument that no publicity is bad publicity, and the truth of the matter is that probably for every person that would protest that bakery, right, or maybe every two people that would protest that bakery, you'd probably have one person that intentionally spent their money there because they were in favor of hating gay people, for lack of a better term, right? But what happens then is that the market will dictate it for itself, and if people as a whole are unwilling to accept that sort of business practice, then people speaking with their money will force that business to go under. They will cause that business to go out of business. So if they disapprove of some behavior, the market itself will take appropriate actions to curb said behavior, right? Hopefully, and I don't know that people will do this, but hopefully no person in America will buy a ticket with United Airlines anytime soon, right? Because if we really find that the action of United Airlines kicking a doctor off a flight while he's on his way to go see some patient, if we find that action to be abhorrent, then we can take the subsequent action of refusing to fly United and picking a different airline, even if the other airline is slightly more expensive. Right?
Most people aren't gonna do that. They're gonna look at the price and see, oh, United is cheaper, they're gonna buy that ticket. It's the time they need and the lower price.
Well, and there might be some truth to that, but then do we really care?
The majority of people wouldn't care enough to.
Then it should be an acceptable practice. Because here's the truth of the matter is that you're right. Most people wouldn't care, right? And most people wouldn't care until it actually happens to them, right? So most people don't care until their 12-year-old is the one that's not let on the airplane because she's wearing leggings. Which, if I remember correctly, that was United as well, right? Okay? Or you don't care until you're the one that's randomly selected to give up your seat and you're forced to miss your planes. Right? And then you give a damn. Then you care. Alright? But this is the idea of regulation being unnecessary because ultimately the market will determine for itself. And if we don't have a problem with United Airlines beating this little poor Asian doctor up and kicking him off his flight, then oh well. We'll keep flying United Airlines, and that's what we are as a country and as a person and as human beings. We don't care. So long as it's not us, right, being thrown to the ground and becoming concussed and getting beaten up, we don't care about other people. There's probably some truth to that. Oh well, go on about your day. But then don't whine and complain when it happens to affect you personally. Right? Because that's hypocritical. Alright, additionally, other arguments against regulations, that regulations are inefficient. Alright, this is probably a true statement. This is a true statement due in large part to the fact that the United States government is always, and always should be, always will be, and always should be reactionary. The government doesn't have the opportunity to sort of take the lead on anything, which means that they're always playing catch up to everything that's happening, then those regulations are always going to be cumbersome and inefficient. Alright? And it's again, the reactionary nature of government, that's sort of how it's supposed to be. We don't want a government that it's so easy to change things that it can be at like the forefront of innovation, right? Number 3 here, regulations kill jobs. That's an accurate statement, right? The more regulations that you have, the more you sort of tie companies' hands, the harder you make it for them to expand sometimes. some regulations, like EPA regulations as it pertains to some energy sectors, make it nearly impossible for those jobs to continue, right? Coal, for example, being one.
Outsourcing, is that how that starts?
It can, right? So when you look at like regulations for work hours and things like that, yes, right? When you look at regulations for minimum wages, yes, that's how you get factories that go overseas, right? Because I can go build a factory in China right now and pay a 12-year-old 50 cents a day to go make shoes and tell him he can't even have a bathroom break, and that little boy is thrilled he's got a job, right? But I can't get away with that in America. Regulations increase prices. Again, if I am making it here in the United States and I've got to pay my workers a livable wage, that increases my cost of production. Am I just going to eat that? No. In turn, I'm going to increase the cost of my product. So regulations do increase prices as well. All right. And then you can make the argument that regulations have become sort of unreasonable, right? Especially when you look at certain like EPA regulations. So you've had instances in which like the EPA cut down on 90% of pollution for some aspect of what's going on. And then they make another regulation that says you need to cut it by another 90%, and then another regulation that says you need to cut it by another 90%, to the point where ultimately what you have done is you've almost cut pollution down to zero, but you're still putting more regulations on it, trying to make it cleaner and cleaner and cleaner. At which point you hit that point of diminishing returns. Do you learn about that in economics? We know that concept, diminishing returns? Maybe, maybe not. What do you learn in economics?
Graphs. ADAS.
How to make video for music.
All right. We're going to talk, we got enough time here. We're going to get through environmental policy. We won't even get into the deregulation of environmental policy. Let's be honest, in 5 years, this might be an absolutely pointless part of this class. Well, it might be. I mean, Donald Trump's talking about even getting rid of the EPA altogether. I don't think he'll do that, but that is something that he at least mentioned on the campaign trail, right? So we have the Environmental Protection Agency, which is created in order to protect our environment in various ways. The first thing that I want you to understand about this is that there's an aspect of federalism that's at play here that's rather significant. Right? Because the regulations on business and sort of overall cleanliness and things like that, states have this sort of belief that they should be at the forefront of it, right? And so if one state would like to pollute a little bit more in order to try to create jobs and boost its economy, it should have that authority. And if another state wants to put more regulations in place and pollute less, it should have that authority as well. And then ultimately, you, the person, you can decide which state you want to live in. Makes sense, right? And except the national government has sort of become more and more prominent in terms of environmental regulations. Because some of it makes sense, right? Like take the Mississippi River, for instance. So the United States government is going to take over the Mississippi River and basically make the claim that because this is a navigable river, it doesn't really belong to an individual state. Rather, it belongs to many states, and therefore it should be the response of national government because it's interstate commerce. That all makes sense to you, right? We get that concept? Mississippi River, interstate commerce, national government gets to respond. Yay, that's wonderful, all right? What about the little tiny, like, I don't know, Snake River? I don't even know the names of all the tributaries, right? But the little tiny, like, Snake River that goes through 3 states and then flows into the Mississippi, right? Who gets to control that? What if it only flows through one state and then goes into the Mississippi? if the water goes into the Mississippi and it becomes a part of the Mississippi eventually, does the national government get to control that as well? See, the national government says yes. In fact, the national government has gotten to the point where basically it makes the argument that all water eventually runs off either into a major river or into an ocean, therefore we get to control it. Alright? This is really a large part of our struggle here between a national and state government as it pertains to environmental protections. Alright? Additionally, you see sort of similar things with clean air as well. Right? Because obviously, or hopefully, maybe I don't want to say obviously, hopefully we recognize that air is constantly in motion. We know this fact? Right? So the air that is currently over Houston is eventually going to be over what? New Orleans. Yes? Trust me. Okay? In reality, what you have is sort of circular airflow down here, like in this direction. Right? So it'll come up and then it goes that way, and then you have circular airflow in this direction that goes that way. And that's why you have tornadoes in, like, Kansas. Look at that, I'm teaching you science. Just don't ask for anything else, I know nothing else about science. Alright? But you have airflow that is constantly moving, right? And for the most part, it moves across the United States from the west to the east, right? That's why you have, if you ever get on a transcontinental airplane, right, it takes about like 4 hours and 15 minutes to fly from the west coast to the east coast, but it takes like 5 hours to fly from the east coast to the west coast. Because in one direction you're going into the wind, and in the other direction the wind's pushing. So y'all probably didn't know that either. Alright? Now, I want you to understand that for the vast majority of Americans, environmental protections is not a matter of whether or not it should exist, but rather it is a matter of the extent to which environmental protections exist, right? The vast majority of Americans, I mean, with the exception of like the most hardcore anti-government sort of Republicans, everybody would basically admit that some sort of regulation of the environment is a positive thing, okay? Because obviously you don't want your neighbor to be, you know, fracking on his own property because that will destroy your property. Right? You don't want your neighbor, excuse me, to be using his backyard as a landfill. Because obviously you don't want all that filth and trash and stuff right next to your house. Right? So, most people will agree that there needs to be some sort of regulation, and then it simply becomes a matter of extent, right? Because we do want a clean environment, and so we want businesses to be concerned about it, but then the issue becomes, at what point have we put too many restrictions on business at the expense of jobs and other things of that nature, right? So it becomes an extent thing for most Americans rather than a yes or no sort of aspect. When we look at some of the key legislation that's come out of environmental policy, I want you to understand the Clean Air Act and Clean Water Acts are basically the two that you really need to sort of understand. Alright? So when you look at like Clean Air Acts, there are emission standards for both cars and for factories. So you know that when you go and get a car now, you have to, well, not when it's brand new, but after it's been like a couple of years, you have to go and get an emissions check on your automobile regularly to ensure that it's not polluting too much. Alright? Factories have to do similar things. In fact, the power plant over here was in the news like a year ago, maybe less than a year ago, for its policy policies as it pertains to the Clean Air Act. Right? Then we also have various Clean Water Acts, alright? So trying to ensure that we're not polluting our waterways as well. And again, water and air are really the two sort of most predominant in that regard, because they are mobile, right? So, I mean, if you pollute the ground, like the soil in one specific spot, oh well, not that huge of a deal. What you ultimately end up with is, you know, one small area of contamination. Water and air, on the other hand, are constantly moving. Now, with our environmental policies, there are 4 different types. I left this on the board over here, right, because it's still the same. Okay, so entrepreneurial types have what? Narrow cost, wide benefit. Right? Right? Exact same thing here with the other ones, right? Narrow cost, wide benefit, entrepreneurial. And so some of your examples here are things like Clean Air Acts. So if we are forcing factories to control pollution, they are the ones that are bearing the cost of it. Yet we are all the ones that are benefiting from it because we get to breathe cleaner air. Right? And hopefully you understand, I mean, there are some countries in the world today where like, you're told not to go outside on certain days. Right? And when China hosted the Olympics, what, 4 years ago, 5 years ago?
2008.
Really? Beijing Olympics was 08? That long ago?
I know.
Okay, sure, we'll go with that. Like people were walking around in like the surgical masks. You remember seeing that? Because people didn't want to breathe the air in China because it's that bad, the quality is that low. Alright? Next, majoritarian policies, everybody pays, everybody benefits. Good example of this is gasoline tax prices. Right? Y'all realize that, well, just wait, go to California. In California, 50% of the cost of gas is taxes. Almost 50%. Alright, when I was in grad school, gasoline in San Diego, California was like $4.50 a gallon.
I went to California over spring break and like the gas here was like 180 and we went and it was like 3 something.
Yeah.
Like,
Right? So, I mean, it's a significant difference. And it has been for some time now, right? And so California is a good example of that, but everybody's paying because if you're driving, you're paying for it, right, with the extra tax. And everybody benefits because that money's supposed to go to increasing air quality, so everybody's benefiting. Interest group policies right down here, narrow cost, narrow benefit, right? These are really more like dumps or things like that, right? So much smaller involvement, right? And then you have client, that's the last one there, right? Client groups, wide cost, narrow benefits, right? So the Arctic Wildlife Refuge, things like that, everybody's paying, but only a small part are benefiting, right? So what's the Endangered Species Act?
That's the world's endangered species.
No. I know what the Endangered Species Act is. It's in the name.
Sorry.
What type of policy is it?
Interest groups.
Kyle, why is it interest group?
I mean, interest groups lobby for that, but I don't know, the benefits are narrow because there's not a lot of species since they're endangered. And I guess the cost
So explain to me how it's narrow cost and wide benefit.
Wide benefit, keeps them, I don't know, you get to see them alive for longer. I don't know, everyone likes it, and then narrow cost, wait.
Yeah, I don't care.
Yeah.
Do you actually see them? Name an animal in the endangered species list.
The Elgin seal just got off. Bengal tiger.
Guys,
Black rhino.
Silverback gorilla.
you could actually throw out any animal right now, and I would have no idea if you're telling me the truth, because I don't know a single animal on the list. I don't care.
The elephant seal. It was. Oh, the manatee just got off the list. That was just at risk.
So, can we make an argument for this being client?
Yeah.
Yeah. Can we make an argument for it being majoritarian?
Maybe, yeah.
How would everybody benefit from the Endangered Species Act?
Preserve our world's
Grace, what's that?
I have no idea.
You're on the right track. We are all part of an ecosystem, right? If you change the ecosystem, do you not change all sorts? I mean, if you take out one animal out of a food chain, right? What happens then?
We lose the bees, we're all screwed.
Right. One thing then overpopulates because there's no predator for it anymore. Right? One predator is now going to shrink and possibly become endangered themselves because they no longer have a food source. And so it would drastically change the ecosystem, which ultimately could affect everybody. So if we make sure that these endangered species are not going extinct, it could benefit everyone. Alright? We'll stop there, and tomorrow we'll get into deregulation of environmental policy. And I'll try to make tomorrow a little bit more current for you.